This is a photograph of Mary Dorman in our first show, The Midsummer Revels, in 1982. And it was a wonderful show, and she was terrific. That's it. Since the show.
Okay.
Ready?
Yes, go.
It's May 18th, 2003, and this is another videotape of North Fork women. Today we're talking with Mary Dorman, who's a long-term North Fork resident, lawyer, activist, and an old friend. Mary, when did you first remember being in Orient?
Probably 6 or 7 or 8 years old. My grandfather and grandmother had a house here on Village Lane, and I first remember having come visit them.
And you have a brother and a sister,
I do.
and parents who are no longer in residence in that place.
Correct. They left last year.
In a assisted facility.
Yes.
Okay. Tell me just briefly the schools you went to. I know you had a very broken up childhood because your family was in Libya.
Well, my father was in the Foreign Service, and he was an Arabist. He was born and raised in Beirut with his 4 brothers and sisters. So he was fluent in Arabic, as each of them were. And he joined the Foreign Service, and he was stationed basically throughout North Africa, beginning in Tunisia, where I was born, Morocco, where my sister was born, then Ethiopia, Paris, Libya. Then he retired and became Director of American Archaeology in Egypt and lived in Cairo for 10 years.
That's a long trip.
Yeah. But throughout that time, the only home that I ever knew in the United States was Orient. And we would return to Orient either once every 3 years for the summer or once every 2 years and go back to wherever my father was posted. And then when they moved to Cairo, they would come every summer. And I would usually come here and work in the summer unless I would cross the Atlantic and wave at them in the air, going to Cairo while they came to Orient. And that was always fun.
I remember you working in the motel one summer.
Yes,
Yeah, I've heard about that.
South Shore Motel, cleaning rooms.
That's what she
Something
does.
I'm
Cleaning.
sure you remember vividly.
Every time I pass it, I, genuflect to rooms 1 through 19. But yeah, and I was also a short order cook for the Junior Yacht Club, and I taught sailing here, and I was Junior Commodore, and so I had really quite a time. And one of my most wonderful memories is visiting my Uncle Gerald, who had just bought a house here, a little compound down on Village Lane with a cottage in back and the dock out front. And he brought me out one weekend. I must have been 12 years old, and he set me up on the dock with a hand line, clams, and a bushel basket. And I caught 1 bushel basket full of blowfish, which are, harder to find at this point. And of course, everybody believed those to be a trash fish, and as we know, they really are fabulous sea squab, is what we call them. And he taught me how to clean them, and he taught me how to skin eels, and he taught me how to bait hooks, and then, so I got very, very early into fishing, which was augmented really by my cousin MacKay, who's sitting here, who at that point had a canoe on the Sound, correct?
Canoe.
And out we went paddling in the canoe on the Sound. Again, it was the whole hand line genre of fishing. Initiated, I think, by the cod fishers of Nova Scotia. And there we were, sitting in the canoe, pulling up porgies, saw my first skate. In fact, went on to date people who had that same expression. And what else? Small flounder, and then fiddler crabs for blackfish on hand lines, right off Blackfish Rock. So, and Ann taught me how to clean them and cook them and all the spots.
Your schooling got very interrupted. I know you had some early school in Libya and then got back to a high school here.
Well, I went wherever my parents were. I went to school. I went to Italian schools in Ethiopia. I went to a French school in Paris, as well as American community schools, Air Force schools. And then I was in my fourth high school. I went to Greenport High School for 3 months. I was the first new student they had had in years. And when I left, oh, so I'll tell you a little vignette about that. Lisa Lieblein, who is now one of the owners of Port of Egypt, Lieblein family always owned Port of Egypt, was one of my best buddies. I came from Libya to Greenport High School. It was huge. I was really kind of just paralyzed with fear and didn't know anybody. And Lisa Lieblein and another girl named Judy Cook and I became 3 fast best friends. And they were just fabulous to me. And they would make sure I got to the football games and knew what team to root for. I knew what our uniforms looked like and all this. And also Lee Fitting would sit next to me on the bus. So I felt really, really, really great. And so I was there 3 months, and then we moved to Washington. I went to Washington school. But I would say about 3 years ago, I was in Port of Egypt, and I bought all my boats from Lisa. And I said to her, I got all choked up, and I said, you really, really helped me through Greenport High School. I was so foreign. It was so new. I was such an outsider. I'd come from so far away. And you and Judy were just so, so great to me. And she said to me, "What do you mean?" She said, "The principal called us in and assigned us to you." And here I thought it was like the greatest love and friendship, and I was an assignment. So anyway, I did get through.
But she can remember you those
Oh
days.
yes, no. She said we would have been friends anyway.
Then you went off finally to college, Northwestern?
No. That's like my mother, It's Ohio Wesleyan. And when I came back the first Thanksgiving and got off the plane, and Aunt Grace Wells was with my mother, and there was someone else with me from Ohio Wesleyan, my mother said, "Oh, this is Sis's friend Robert from Oberlin." I was like, "Ma, I go to Ohio Wesleyan." But anyway, so it's Ohio Wesleyan.
That's very good.
Did you enjoy that?
No. It's a total cultural vacuum. Ohio, I've never been back there. It was emotionally and socially scarring, but it...
Ohio.
Yeah, I took my junior year in Mexico, that broke it up. And
You broke your leg.
a lot of times. Broke all my bones. But and then I decided, I would always go back to New York City whenever I could. I was cosmopolitan. I felt very different from other people. I always had boyfriends, but I wasn't, felt something was missing. And in New York City, ultimately, I found that lesbian community that became so important to me. And I decided to go to law school, and that's where I wanted to go, to some urban area, either Boston or New York. And it turned out I was accepted at St. John's right after college, and came here to go to school in New York. And then Orient was that much more available to me, summer times and weekends. My parents weren't here, but I would stay in their big old lonely house. And again, I got close with you, Ann, and who, as I've said before, and I will probably say again, really was instrumental in getting me through law school, both feeding me hamburgers and moral support too.
When did you realize Anne was gay? When you were really little, or was that just something you always knew? Or?
Well, I knew she always lived with Carol. I think I always knew that she was gay, but the vocabulary wasn't so, available.
I know, yeah.
But I knew, partner, or, with Carol at that point, and I really got to know you very well because you didn't know how to drive.
Oh, that's right.
And you had a car, and after you split with Carol, I drove you in and out of Manhattan, and
Thank you.
that worked for me.
Now, when you were at law school, it was a real turning time in feminism, and you were an activist.
It was. I was 8 women, one of 8 women out of 350 students. Vietnam had just ended. I was also the youngest. A lot of Vietnam vets were coming back to school on the very first day of law school. I answered questions such as, "What are you doing here?" And I thought, I would say, well, I want to be a lawyer, and but what they were saying is, why is a woman taking up a space that a man should have? And it was St. John's, it was Catholic, it was very conservative. Up until the year I got there, men had to wear suits. Similar to my mother, who rarely wore skirts or dresses, I quit wearing them at that point after my first year and started wearing Levi's and trousers, and they didn't know really what to do with me. But also, my first week in law school, we were divided up into two sections, so it was about 150 or 70 in a room. And it was contracts, and we had a guy named Fagan up there with all that connotes. That was his name, that was his personality. And the subject was contracts. So he called on me the very first day of school, and I mean, it's total inner hysteria for everybody, but everybody's so relieved that it was not them that was being called on. So I was standing, and literally my knees were shaking uncontrollably, and the guy sitting next to me just leaned over and he shoved the chair behind my knees, so that to steady my knees, which I really appreciated. I really bonded with that guy. So then the teacher began this, quote, Socratic dialogue, and it was very difficult, and he was really hammering me. Fine, that lasted about 20 minutes. The second day, he called me again, out of 170 people. So I'm up there again, and then he said, okay, we'll take a break for 15 minutes, and we'll continue with Miss Dorman. At that point, everybody in the class began to see that this was really, he was unduly picking on me. And then the third day, he called me again, and everybody kind of hissed under their, because it was so patently unfair. And at one point he said to me, Miss Dorman. I was like, yes. He said, don't you think you've made a mistake by coming to law school? And I said, yes, oh yes, I do. Because at that point I really did. And he said, don't you think you would have done better as a go-go dancer?
Ooh.
And I said, I definitely do think that I would, because go-go dancing was, I was pretty good at it. But, the hisses and boos of my colleagues at that point corrected the situation, and they backed off. But, that's what I was facing in those days.
You started a newsletter.
Oh yes, I did. I started a newsletter. The way what had happened, I didn't know any lesbians other than Anne and a group of her friends who became my friends out here in Orient. Beth Allen, Jane Chambers, Jan Swanson, people who were very, very supportive of me going through law school. And Anne was at Dalton at that point teaching, and you introduced me to some lesbians my age. And so Women Music Network was born. Alex Dodkin, Liza Cowan, Penny House. And at the law school, I started a women's group, and we started a newsletter, or kind of a large sheet of paper where we isolated, abstracted really, really sexist comments that were going on in the school or being published in the law school paper. So yeah, we started a women's group, and feminism was happening, and I was a part of it. I just gravitated toward that stuff.
I want to go back to the people you met, Liza Cowley,
Liza Cowan.
Liza, not Cowley.
Cowan.
Because you became a lawyer for that first record,
Mhm.
Lavender Jane Loves Women.
Mm-hmm. It's one thing I've always said is that I was practicing law in law school, and set up a not-for-profit corporation for Women's Music Network that produced and recorded Lavender Jane Loves Women. And I was lucky enough to be in the Grandmama Chorus or whatever that was. But that was fun. That was fun. And it was important. It was an important album. It was an important time. It was important, again, this vocabulary of being able to say, you're a lesbian, I'm a lesbian, we're lesbians, we're feminists. And it certainly had a big, big impact on...
It was the first record.
It was the first. And we also produced a lot of women's concerts at you know, in Washington Square and Hudson Memorial and all of that. And so that was big. Kay Gardner, she was huge. And she went off, of course, to have her own illustrious career.
When you got out of law school, you made a decision not to go into a firm.
And you know, one of my specialties now is employment discrimination. And every client that comes in underlines the correctness of my choice not to work for somebody. Because I am somebody who's autonomous, I am somebody who needs to explore things on my own. I think it was not the easiest thing to do, start off on my own practice, but I am autonomous. I can pick and choose who I represent, I can pick and choose my issues, and I wouldn't do it any other way. So that's been 28 years in private practice, and I'm doing very well.
And some of it got pretty public with talk about St. Patrick's Day.
Well, I did get involved with someone I work with now, Paul O'Dwyer, when he was representing ILGO, Irish Lesbians and Gays, who had been excluded from marching in the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. To be a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernia, you have to be a white, Catholic, male, heterosexual of Irish heritage. I do not qualify, and neither do a lot of my gay and lesbian friends. So the Hibernians, it has been established, and rightly so, legally, that such a parade is a private parade, because we don't want Hibernians in the Gay Pride Parade. But what ILGO, Irish and Lesbians and Gays, were doing, they were protesting their exclusion from the parade. So we had applied for permits from the NYPD to have a protest prior to the parade on Fifth Avenue to protest their exclusion. And of course, these permits were routinely denied. And of course, the ILGO would get routinely arrested because they would go ahead with the demonstration and they would step in front of those city buses, which came on Fifth Avenue, and stop traffic, and it kind of came this, you know, this metaphor of stepping off the curb, you know, to protest really homophobia. So, and you know, it wasn't only ILGO, it would be passers-by and some parents of ILGO and all kinds of people who would, you know, lie down in the middle of Fifth Avenue and get arrested, and there you would have 120, 180, 200 arrestees, and they would be represented by Paul O'Dwyer and myself. And actually, it was fabulous performance pieces, the trials. And 3 years in a row, we did about 120 to 150 trials in groups of 15 or 20 in 1 week. So we would have one judge and, you know, court officers and the whole thing. And the beautiful part about it is we would make them go through every single legal technicality to prove their case. If they had videotapes, we got the videographers to get up there and testify and really put them to their proof, because we felt that even the city of New York was discriminating against homosexuals, gays and lesbians, for not giving the permit, for giving this, you know, we would just have one little protest and then go home to brunch. It would be so easy. Anyway, the beautiful thing about these trials was that after our clients were convicted, and if we had 200, we would have 199 convictions and 1 dismissal. Because they would all be on video waving at their mothers in front of the buses sitting in the street, you know. But what was really beautiful about it was after they were convicted and before they were sentenced, they could make a statement and they could address the court. And that was really one of the most moving times that I've ever seen, where these people, whether it's a passerby or an Irish person, would say why they were arrested was huge.
Was that on
I
video?
cried, the court reporter would cry, the judge would go like this. But you know, and then there would be all sentenced to community
Do you think
service.
that's on video somewhere?
What we do have is the transcript of their statements, because it was all taken down. And I think, the Irish woman, anyway, who's writing a book about it is incorporated, but we might be able to get it. But they are really, really good. Christine Quinn was there, Michael Cunningham was there, the great author, Tony Kushner, Tom Duane. It would be famous people, and it would be,
Great.
pedestrians. Yeah, it was great.
Just
So
great.
that was very good. And I also represented probably 1,000 ACT UP, 500 Women's Health Action Mobilization.
Just say what ACT UP is.
It's an activist group bringing attention to the AIDS crisis and the causes of the crisis. Very direct action, a lot of demonstrations, a lot of in-your-face to the cops, authority, pharmaceutical companies, a lot of arrests, a lot of courage in the face of death, because these people died, and they knew they were going to die. So boy, and that's where I've gotten a lot of my courage is from my clients, because if they're courageous enough to lie down in the streets, I'm courageous enough to stand there and help them out any way I can.
Boy. And then Women's Action Committee came out of that?
Women's Health Action Mobilization came out of that, and then Women's Action Coalition was a subsequent. WHAM was with ACT UP, and then WAC started. In response really to the Anita Hill hearings in October of '91, where our elected officials were, Clarence Thomas, who had been head of the EEOC, was up for nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. Anita Hill, professor of law at the University of Oklahoma, came forward and accused him of sexual harassment in the most graphic, disgusting ways, and she was absolutely credible. And here, Senators Hatch and Specter and Kennedy, appointed Clarence Thomas without a word, and basically branded her incredible. And it was so unpalatable and to feminists at large that there was a huge groundswell across the country. A lot of feminist groups and women who weren't particularly feminist responded. And Women's Action Coalition was formed by a few of us, grew exponentially, and also into a direct action group with much success. Water?
Sorry about the slight interruption.
Okay.
Tell us about a couple of the big cases you had.
Well, the most notorious, I would say. One was a very interesting case of an American who was an employee of the United Nations, a woman, Catherine Claxton, who alleged that she had been sexually harassed by an Undersecretary General of the UN, an Argentinian named Gomez, who was also the controller of the United Nations, and therefore very popular with the American delegation because he was very good at managing the money at the UN. And Catherine alleged that Gomez had basically mauled her, kissed her, grabbed her, bruised her, and she had made the complaint to supervisor, and nothing had become of it. And she was relentless and would not let it go. Secretary General at this time was Boutros Ali of Egypt, aka Boo Boo. And finally, because Catherine was relentless in her complaint and pursuing her complaint, the media got involved a little bit, and about the reluctance of Boutros to do anything in regard to his buddy Gomez and his undersecretary. So finally, Boutros Ali appointed Mela Carroll, a judge of the High Court of Ireland, to come to the United Nations and try Claxton versus the UN. I was co-counsel with Ellen Yaroshevsky, a professor of law at Yeshiva Law School, and our adversary was Alan Dershowitz. I always believed that Alan Dershowitz was paid for by the UN with his team, and we proceeded to have the trial in the UN. And Boutros had said that the trial had to be in camera, meaning in secret. We were not permitted to speak about it to anybody. And it was a judge-only trial, and she would decide the guilt or innocence of Gomez. The trial took 16 days. And one of the witnesses for us, for Catherine, was Kofi Annan, the current Secretary General. And it was intense, very intense. And for instance, I would get calls from CNN saying, we want to interview you. I said, you know, can't do it, it's in camera. And they said, oh, that's okay. What time are you going to be in court tomorrow? I said, well, we arrive every day around 8:30. They said, fine, we'll be waiting for you. We're going to ask questions, just look into the camera and say no comment. And it was fabulous. I would get there and they'd say, is it true there's a secret trial going on in the UN? I would look at the camera and I'd pause and say, no comment. So anyway, then after 16 days of testimony and Gomez denied the whole thing, Mela Carroll went back to Ireland, and within a few weeks we had a 24-page decision finding Gomez absolutely guilty, and her having found him de facto incredible. We were given a copy of the decision. It was specially marked original. We were told it could not be copied by anyone. It could not be shown to anyone. And it was clear to me that Dershowitz had gotten the copy before we had gotten it for certain reasons. Gomez was fired that day, and 2 days later he was rehired by the United Nations on the same terms. And when we inquired of the Secretary General what, if anything, further was going to happen to Gomez, or did Claxton or Plank would she get any damages, there was no answer. So we did have a woman attorney who was about to retire from the UN, who had coached us in UN procedure, and she was just going to retire. And I'm not saying it's through her, but somehow the decision of Mela Carroll got to the press, and it blew the whole thing wide open.
Great.
And Gomez left for Argentina 2 days later, and that was it. And we settled, Catherine and the attorney's fees settled for about $350,000, and she's still there. So that was Catherine Claxton versus the UN, and it was really, really, really huge. Her picture was I was going to the gym. It was I forget what year, and I saw the post, and no, it was Daily News. It was like, she won. I thought, wow, who won? And there it was, Catherine Claxton on the front page. It was absolutely fabulous.
Just great.
So then, just two brief other cases. One was right out here. It was a member of our softball team, Elizabeth Youngling, who was a Suffolk County police officer, and she had taken the sergeant's test and passed it. And then you kind of go to the top of a civil service list for sergeant, and she was at the top of that list, and she should have been, and out of something like 680 supervisory officers in Suffolk County Police Department, that sergeant and above, 2 were women. And she'd made it to the top of the list, and they had appointed ahead of her 2 sergeants, both under probation, one for stalking a woman and passing out on her lawn waving his gun, and another for drawing a gun and getting in a fight in a bar. And here Liz had been absolutely, super police officer with commendations, etc. So we sued for discrimination, and we won. She was appointed sergeant, and she's on her way to lieutenant, and that was fabulous. We were on the softball team. I said, Liz, what's up? He goes, oh, terrible. I didn't make sergeant. I was like, what? And so we took it from there.
Great.
And then the most recent case is a case I did with my very fine colleague, Colleen Meenan, a former NYPD sergeant. And it was discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and harassment of a gay cop by his co-officers over a period of 12 years. And it was a huge case. It was a very expensive and time-consuming case, in that we had deposed maybe 16, 18 police officers, captains, sergeants, commanders, and we did in fact prove that the torture of him really took place and was sanctioned by the commanding officers, including things like handcuffing him in the precinct and hanging him up on a coat rack, and sergeants would come and laugh as well. And that was the biggest settlement for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation ever against the police department, and we settled for $1.2 million last summer. So that was good. And the point being is that there was other relief in all of these cases, that the police department would send out guidelines and educate everybody that this is no longer tolerated. So then there's that affirmative relief, which has longer reach than simply the money.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
great.
amazing.
I remember
Congratulations,
years
Irene.
and years ago, first when you were fooling around with men and treating them the way men treat women.
I don't remember that yet.
I remember that vividly.
Oh,
You were
that's good.
using them up.
Yeah,
You were
they were begging for it.
you were fooling with them and then saying goodbye.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about fooling with them, but I was. They would do things for me. But I've always had men friends. I mean, that's fine. But I certainly realized that I much preferred women. I never got to the point of being anti-male by any means, but I've always preferred women.
You remember what turned your life around?
I guess, transition was, and it was a hard transition. Some of those women that you introduced me to were the most recently divorced and the most separatist. They had a life with men or in a male society or with male parameters or heterosexual parameters, and then when they left, they became super separatists, and I was never like that. For instance, remember the Alex Dobkin thing, no male babies?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And she was still married then, I think. I never identified with that. But if anything, so many hours in the day to spend with people, my preference is to be with women.
Yeah.
And that came, I would say, as I had the license to do it. And I met them, and certainly Orient became a big part of that because of you and my hanging out with you and Jen and that generation. And then I rented the Tower House, which had been your house and Carol's house for a long time. And I remember that my parents had seen it for rent while they were taking a walk, told me about it, and I went to see it, and it's a funky little joyous place, I have to say, because I did have a lot of joy in that house. And I remember I didn't think I could afford it, and I was looking for someone to share it with. And I remember who that was, Hillary Weiler, who owned Bleak with People in the Village. And she said, well, I just can't come out this weekend, I'll come out next weekend. So I went to see it that weekend, and I decided I'm going to take it no matter what. And I was very glad I took it, and I took it by myself, because it afforded me this wonderful opportunity that I did not have in the city, having a small apartment there, to have guests and companions come out and entertain and make history.
This is a very unusual thing because it had been a water tank, a water tower.
Yes.
And so at the very top there was a tiny little bedroom with 2 bunks, and the next
the best
layer
one.
there were 2 bunks, and
And
then
a toilet.
and a toilet, and sort of a tub.
And I mean toilet.
Yeah. And then down under that, as it got wider, was the kitchen,
Right.
and then off that a living room, and then another bedroom and another bathroom.
Right.
It was very dark in the summer and
Right.
cold in the
Right.
fall.
Right, and the fireplace never really worked, but we would always, I would come out there and invite friends, and we would always warm it up with lobsters, champagne, food, clamming, scalloping, all of that. Always had a little bowl.
I remember Aunt Minnie's stewed crabs from, what was her name?
Oh, that
Owen.
was true. Oh, yeah,
They were good.
yeah, all of that. And so, and that's really how the migration of people I knew, lesbians I knew, started out here, was from those days.
You brought a great many people out.
Mhm.
Here,
I don't
out
mean
here,
that.
out here. That too, Anne, that too.
Sorry, didn't mean that.
That's all right, that's all right. I don't know nothing. But I did bring a lot of people out to Orient.
Yeah.
And my soccer team, we would
Mhm.
play soccer and then drive on out here, slugging pints of tequila in the car. Remember those days? Lucy.
Mhm.
So,
I had my motorcycle when we first
you had your
came
Moto
out.
Guzzi?
That's right.
Mhm. That was good. So,
What's your feeling about our little organization, NFWF? You've seen it grow from nothing.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I think I'm repeating myself because I think it's very good that all this lesbian community is out here, and I'm, as you know, a big supporter and endorser of it. However, I think that we need to integrate ourselves more into the community at large, and we have those examples. One of them is Freddie Waxberger. And I'm telling you that it is one of the reasons I'm going to step up to the office of Commodore of the Yacht Club
Good.
next year. I'm not wild about it. I'm Vice Commodore now, but I think it would be I'm going to do it because I think that there is homophobia. I know that there is in the village and in these environs, you know, a lot of straight people who are not as approving of the gay community out here, or of me, or of my being a lesbian, but too bad. You know, I'm ready to go on the record and do it. So I think it's very important that we get integrated. I think MWFWF has served a purpose, that's for sure. I've always wondered, gee, if my mother, as a heterosexual, needed some insurance help, could she have gotten it? You know, that's an unanswered question, I think. Or else the answer is no, I'm not sure. But so, you know, I think it's done great. I think Jan Swanson has done great. I know it now has a new level of, you know, management. I don't really know these people, but I'm looking forward to some changes in, you know, their money making and how it's handled. You know, I think that where we really have to unite, and I think it's gotten critical, is against the ferry, or against you know what, the Long Beach, you know, the exclusion of Orient boaters from Long Beach. These are public authorities and governmental authorities and large businesses who are using Orient for their own reasons without any dialogue or give and take with us locals, and that's what I consider.
Well, you got a partial victory on the Long Beach.
Yes, yeah,
Yes,
definitely, and I'm convinced that but for the demonstration, there would have been no dialogue at all. So after this, I'll just briefly tell you my ideas about how we can fight this ferry,
Oh, good.
which I think is
Good.
very, very doable.
One of the problems about the organization, I was talking with Phyllis, who's the head of it now, is that as we've gotten so big,
Mm-hmm.
and what's our mailing list, like 500, 400, 500, something like that. Not everybody lives here, but and I think a lot more integration is happening because people live within their little communities and have to relate to neighbors and to things. But I think as an organization, it's going to be in a time of change now. It has to be. It's that big.
And you know, I don't have particular knowledge as to its actual impact. You know, I can read the stats on the number of women it helps and this, that. You know, and I know from healthcare, the condition of healthcare in general, that that's needed, but I don't know what the actual impact is. You know, I know more of the fundraising, the community, the parties, the this and that activities, but I'm sure there's a place for it, and you know, it's what we all have to do. We have to keep our eyes open and have the organizations that we sponsor and are part of, and give our efforts to move into those open spaces as life changes, because, right, it's the joy of life. Who ever thought in our lifetimes we'd be at war, or, you know,
Absolutely.
occupying some foreign countries? Whoever knew. Then we have to, you know, keep control over our lives, so we have to remain activists. It's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it, is that no matter where I am, no matter what dinner party, no matter what coffee, whatever, with what group, the overwhelming feeling of every single person is powerlessness. So that's why, and there are ways to overcome that, I think, first individually and then in a group. And then we get dangerous.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, don't you want to see my tattoo?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Show the
So-
Okay,
tattoo.
stand
Okay.
up. That's good. And turn around, whichever way it
It's
is.
here.
That's it.
I can
Yeah.
put it up on the table.
Yeah, you better put it up on the table. Wait a minute. See, I can't lower my, wait a minute, we're doing a funny thing here. You gotta get the whole mermaid. There we go. This is not professional,
Bring
but
your,
it's there.
just to say, bring your other leg in closer, and then you can swing around a little bit more, maybe.
Oh, that's good, that's good. Now, wait a
This is
minute.
my tattoo, mermaid, unconventional, short spiky hair. Look at those fins, also fins on her arm, pecs. Bubbles. Done by Andrea Elston, one of the finest tattoo artists in the world. And everybody, each one of you should go out and get one.
Fabulous.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Oh, shit.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.